When the world is silent, danger can erupt without warning, testing every second of a hunter's skill and nerve. From the icy wilderness of Ussuri-Krai, where a veteran hunter faced a massive grizzly stalking along a riverbank, to the rugged shores of Kodiak Island, where a colossal boar surged across shallow water toward a lone blind, these hunts push human skill and courage to the limit. On September 25, 2025, the air in the forests of Ussuri-Krai carried the sharp scent of wet alder and the heavy dampness of autumn rain. The season had shifted early, and the mud along the riverbank clung to boots and slowed every step. Sergei Ivanov, a veteran hunter with decades of backcountry experience behind him, had returned to this remote stretch of wilderness with his partner Dmitry Sokolov to track one of the largest grizzlies reported in the region that year. Reports from locals spoke of a giant male weighing close to 1,500 pounds, moving along the valleys and hunting elk at the edge of the water. For Sergei, whose life had always revolved around the balance between predator and prey, the opportunity to face such an animal was both a privilege and a test of every skill he had gathered across a lifetime of hunting. The two men had set their bait station the previous evening, dragging the remains of an elk down toward the shallows where bear tracks had been seen. The plan was simple: wait for the bear to return, approach cautiously, and take a clean shot at distance. Sergei carried his reliable .338 Winchester Magnum, the weapon he trusted for stopping power against large game, while Dmitry kept a heavy 12-gauge loaded with slugs as backup. They knew that in these forests the margin for error was small, and hesitation could mean the difference between walking home and never being found. That morning, Sergei moved ahead of his partner, keeping low among the alder tangles and slick roots, his boots sinking into wet earth. The river beside him rolled slowly, carrying fallen leaves downstream, its surface broken only by the faint drizzle that fell from the gray sky. He reached the bait site and crouched to inspect the elk carcass. The hide was torn apart, the ribs cracked open by immense force, and the ground bore fresh claw marks that left no doubt about the size of the animal. The bear had fed recently and could be close. Sergei's instincts urged caution, yet years of experience had made him calm in such moments, his breathing steady as he studied the ground for direction. The silence of the forest was shattered in an instant. A crashing sound came from the brush to his left, powerful and direct, unlike the cautious movements of other animals. The giant grizzly emerged from the thicket, its fur dark and wet from the rain, its head swinging low as its eyes locked on Sergei with unmistakable intent. At that distance, no hunter could shoulder a rifle in time. Sergei tried to pull his weapon up, but the mud beneath his boots shifted. The alder roots caught his footing, and he realized with brutal clarity that there would be no chance for a steady shot. The bear charged with terrifying speed, covering ground that should have taken seconds in the blink of an eye. Sergei felt his instincts override his fear as he dropped the rifle, stepped toward the beast, and threw his full weight against its massive shoulder. His palms dug into wet fur as he braced his back against a fallen log, using it for leverage. For a moment it felt like pressing against a wall of living muscle, a force that could not be stopped. The bear struck him with one paw, its claws tearing through his chest and arm, shredding his coat and opening deep wounds that seared with sudden heat. Pain flared across his ribs as the weight of the animal forced him backward, but still he pushed, his boots slipping in the mud as he fought to redirect its momentum. The shallow edge of the river was just behind him, and Sergei's desperate strength carried both man and beast into the water. The bear stumbled as the ground shifted beneath it, and for a heartbeat, its speed faltered. The cold current surged around Sergei's legs, mixing with the warmth of his blood, but that brief hesitation was the opening they needed. Dmitry, who had been running from behind, raised his shotgun, steadied himself despite the chaos, and fired a slug into the bear's shoulder. The impact roared across the valley, the giant staggering but refusing to fall, its rage driving it forward again. Sergei twisted free from its chest, gasping as another blow raked across his side, splitting flesh and knocking him into the water. He dragged himself toward the shore with arms that barely obeyed, the mud staining red around him. Dmitry fired again, this time striking the bear closer to the chest. The beast groaned, swaying heavily as it backed toward the brush, unwilling to collapse, yet no longer able to press the attack. Seconds stretched like hours until the animal, wounded but alive, turned and vanished into the forest, its crashing retreat echoing long after it was gone. Silence returned, broken only by Sergei's ragged breathing and the hiss of drizzle on the river. His ribs felt cracked. His left arm hung torn and useless, and blood soaked through his shredded gear. Yet he was alive, his instincts and sheer willpower having bought enough time for his partner to act. Dmitri pulled him from the mud, bound his wounds with strips of torn fabric, and carried him back toward camp, where they had left supplies and a radio. The journey out of the forest was long and agonizing, but Sergei never let his eyes close, refusing to surrender to the darkness that pressed in on him. By the time he reached the hospital in Vladivostok, his body carried broken ribs, lacerations across his chest and forearm, and the marks of claws that would scar him for life. But survival itself was victory. In that remote wilderness where nature offered no mercy, Sergei had proven that quick judgment and unyielding resolve could hold back even the most overwhelming force, if only for a moment. For hunters who dared to enter those forests, his story became another reminder that the line between triumph and tragedy was always as thin as a breath. On December 12, 2023, the morning began with clear skies, the sun hanging low over the rolling hills of central Spain, its pale light cutting through the bare branches of oak and illuminating the frost that clung to every blade of grass. The Montes de Toledo had always been known as one of the country's finest hunting grounds, a landscape where tradition and wealth met, where driven hunts were organized with precision, and where hunters like Javier Morales came to face the challenge of the largest wild boars Europe could offer. For Javier, a man with years of hunting behind him, the opportunity to take part in a luxury drive of this scale was not only a mark of status but also a test of skill, as the terrain here was known for being deceptive, concealing both game and danger beneath its calm surface. The guides moved with quiet authority, leading their guests along trails that wound through the oak forest, marking bait lines of corn that cut through the brush like deliberate invitations to the keelers that roamed the valleys. Javier, wearing full camouflage and boots hardened by many hunts, relied on a high stand for the opening hours. His rifle was across his lap as he scanned the tree lines and undergrowth for movement. He carried a 9.3 x 6.2mm rifle, a weapon respected among European hunters for its stopping power against boar, and he trusted it as much as he trusted his own judgment. The morning passed with the echo of distant dogs, the occasional crack of a shot, and the restless silence that followed until the sound of crashing brush nearby announced that something heavier than deer was stirring. A keeler appeared through the shadows, a massive animal weighing close to 250 kilograms, its tusks gleaming and its shoulders thick with muscle. The guides whispered that this was the very boar that had already broken drives earlier in the season, a creature known for its aggression and refusal to flee when pressed. Javier's pulse quickened as he tracked the animal with his scope, waiting for it to move into the open line of bait. But instead, the boar cut sharply into a thicket, using the dense cover of reeds and brambles to mask its movements, and Javier made the choice to follow on foot, determined to take a clean shot rather than let the beast slip away again. He descended from his stand, careful but urgent, his boots pressing into damp earth as he stalked toward the thicket. The ground looked solid, the reeds bending under frost, but beneath them lay a hidden peat swamp that had been concealed by the cold. Javier's next step sank deep, the mud swallowing his leg to the knee, pulling him off balance and locking him in place. His arms strained as he tried to wrench himself free, the suction of the bog resisting every attempt, the weight of his gear adding to his struggle. The sudden noise of flailing movement startled the Kyler. From inside the reeds came a violent crash as the boar turned back, its small eyes catching sight of Javier's figure struggling in the swamp. With terrifying speed, it charged, smashing through the reeds, water spraying around its body as it came directly for the hunter. Javier lifted his rifle, his shoulder burning with the awkward angle, and fired a desperate shot. The bullet struck the boar's shoulder, grazing rather than stopping it, tearing through hide and flesh but failing to break its charge. The sound of the shot echoed, mingling with the guttural roar of the wounded animal as it stumbled backward, confused and enraged. The swamp slowed both predator and man. The boar staggered, the mud resisting its weight before it spun and forced itself across the stream beyond, splashing water high into the air. Its massive body disappeared into the thicker brush on the far side, retreating but leaving behind the memory of how close it had come to tearing Javier apart. The forest returned to silence, though the hunter's chest still heaved with fear, the moment replaying in his mind with each breath. Pain replaced adrenaline quickly. In his attempt to escape the swamp, Javier twisted his ankle badly, the joint swelling and burning as he dragged himself out of the sucking mud. A branch tore across his thigh as he pulled free, leaving a deep cut that soaked his trousers with blood. He collapsed onto the bank, gasping, his rifle still in his hands, though he no longer had the strength to raise it. It was only the swift arrival of fellow hunters, alerted by the shot and the sound of crashing brush, that prevented the moment from turning worse. They pulled him from the edge, bandaged his wounds with strips of cloth, and half-carried him back through the forest toward the vehicles waiting at the edge of the drive. By the time Javier reached the hunting lodge, his gear was ruined, his ankle was throbbing, and his body was weakened by the loss of blood. The Kyler had escaped into the depths of the Montes de Toledo, scarred but alive, leaving behind only broken reeds and splashes of red on the swamp surface. Javier's pride was wounded as much as his flesh, yet the experience seared a truth into him more deeply than any scar could. Even in the polished setting of luxury hunts, where guides mark trails and gamekeepers bait lines, the wildness of the animal and the unpredictability of the land could rise together without warning, stripping away every layer of comfort and control. The echoes of that charge would stay with him far longer than the pain of his injuries. In the end, he had survived, but the oak forest had reminded him that no hunt was ever truly safe, and no beast ever truly predictable. The last day of November 2024 brought a brittle stillness to the Montana backcountry, where the cold had already taken hold of the valleys and the snow lay in uneven drifts across meadows and timber. Ethan Reynolds and Sam Porter, lifelong friends and seasoned hunters, had set out that morning to track a herd of elk reported moving through a narrow basin tucked between ridges of pine. Both men carried the weight of long experience, proud of the skill that had shaped them since youth, and though the air was sharp enough to burn their lungs, they pushed on, trusting their boots, their rifles, and their knowledge of the land. Hunting season was closing soon, and opportunities like this could not be wasted. They moved quietly, following fresh tracks pressed into the snow along the edge of a winding creek. The water ran thin and black beneath a fragile layer of ice, carrying with it the bitter cold of the mountains, and the sound of the current beneath the frozen skin made the ground hum faintly beneath their feet. Ethan, carrying a heavy pack and a .300 Winchester Magnum, led the way, his eyes fixed on the far bank where the elk had crossed earlier in the morning. Sam trailed a short distance behind with a .308, steady and alert, his breath curling upward in clouds as he scanned the timberline for movement. The crossing looked possible, though not without risk. A shelf of ice stretched outward, dusted with snow that masked its thinness, and the creek narrowed just enough to tempt a careful step. Ethan moved forward, his boots sinking into the crust with a brittle crack, and he balanced his rifle against his shoulder as he tested each placement. The forest around him was silent except for the soft hiss of wind through bare branches, a silence that always meant something waited unseen. It broke in an instant. From the dense timber across the bank came a crashing roar of movement, heavy and direct. Not the cautious step of elk or deer, but the violent surge of something far more dangerous. An enormous grizzly, its coat thick with early winter weight and its muscles rolling beneath, burst from the shadows with startling speed. Drawn by the scent of elk and the human tracks mingled with them, it had followed silently until now, and its dark eyes locked on Ethan with sudden fury. The bear charged straight onto the frozen shelf. The combined weight of beast and man shattered the ice beneath them with a sickening crack, sending Ethan plunging waist-deep into near-freezing water. The shock seized his breath, pain stabbing through his chest as he tried to hold his rifle above the current, but the bear was already upon him, thrashing in the water with claws that tore across his shoulder and arm. The blows ripped fabric and flesh alike, deep lacerations burning as though lit with fire even in the icy torrent. Ethan fell hard against a submerged rock, the impact cracking one of his ribs, the sharp pain spreading with every desperate movement. Sam acted on instinct. From the bank, he raised his rifle, heart pounding, and fired into the air first, hoping to startle, but the bear did not flinch. It clawed again at Ethan, snarling, its breath rising like steam in the cold. Sam steadied, aimed low to avoid striking his friend, and fired again. The crack of the shot split the valley, echoing across the frozen basin. The bullet struck close enough to jar the animal, tearing through the air beside it, and though not a killing hit, it was enough to break the momentum. The bear twisted, confused by the sudden pain and noise, then bellowed one last roar before retreating, dragging itself across the broken ice to the far bank and crashing back into the timber where it had come from. The silence afterward was heavier than the attack itself. Ethan gasped for breath, his body shaking violently as the cold water drained his strength, every heartbeat a struggle against the chill that sank into him like iron. His shoulder and arm poured blood that mingled with the stream, his ribs screaming with each attempt to move, and the weight of his gear threatened to pull him under again. Sam threw his rifle across the bank, dropped to his knees, and hauled his friend up with both arms, straining to pull him onto solid ground. The ice cracked and shifted beneath them, but finally Ethan rolled free of the creek, collapsing onto the snow with his chest heaving and his skin pale. They had no time to rest. The cold cut into them mercilessly, soaking their clothes and numbing their hands until fingers stiffened on rifle stocks and pack straps. Ethan tried to stand but stumbled, his ankle twisted from the fall, his body refusing to obey. Sam hooked an arm under his shoulder, half dragging him, half carrying him, both men hobbling back through the drifts toward the trail they had broken earlier in the day. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every sound magnified as though the bear might return at any moment. When they finally reached the ridge that led back toward their truck, both collapsed for a moment, soaked, bruised, and trembling from cold and fear. Ethan pressed a hand against his shoulder to slow the bleeding, his breath ragged, while Sam tore strips from his own undershirt to bind the wounds as best he could. They knew the nearest road was still miles away, and that survival depended on moving despite the pain. Step by step, leaning on each other, they forced themselves forward until the valley was behind them. Later, when wildlife officials heard the account, they confirmed what hunters had long understood but never truly wished to face. Even when the target was elk, even when the hunters were skilled and prepared, the wilderness could shift in an instant, and the appearance of another predator could turn the balance of power upside down. The officials noted how thin ice and unstable terrain magnified the danger, creating a trap where man and beast met without warning. For Ethan and Sam, the lesson was etched deeper than words. The scars on Ethan's arm and the ache in his ribs would remain, reminders that no matter how experienced, no matter how ready, the land itself could betray them when least expected. And the image of the grizzly, its roar echoing as ice shattered and water swallowed them both, would remain in their memory as a testament to how fragile survival could be in the cold valleys of Montana. On September 21, 2024, the air over Kodiak Island carried the sharp tang of salt and spruce, the skies low and gray, the wind sweeping in from the sea with autumn's chill. Veteran hunter Jake Thompson had arrived days earlier, drawn to the legendary bears of the island, creatures known to tower above all others in both size and ferocity. His target was a giant bear that guides had estimated at 950 pounds, a dominant male that had left massive tracks along riverbanks and claw marks on tree trunks deep in the forest. For Jake, who had spent a lifetime pursuing game across North America, this was the challenge he had dreamed of, one that demanded precision, endurance, and unflinching resolve. He set up a ground blind on the edge of a glacial-fed lake, choosing a position where the shoreline curved into a shallow inlet, offering both cover and a clear shot. The air was damp and cold, seeping into his layered camouflage, but he waited with patience, trusting his scent-blocking spray and the discipline that had carried him through countless hunts before. Hours stretched in silence, broken only by the distant call of gulls and the steady ripple of the lake, until the first faint light of dawn began to spill across the water. The bear appeared then, stepping from the far shoreline with a presence that made the earth itself feel smaller. Its shoulders rolled with muscle, its fur dark and heavy, and even at a distance it seemed to radiate the dominance of a creature that feared nothing. Jake steadied his .375 H&H Magnum, the rifle pressed firm against his shoulder, and exhaled as he squeezed the trigger. The recoil punched back, the shot echoing across the lake, and the bear staggered, hit hard but not stopped. Instead of collapsing, the giant roared, its voice reverberating like thunder through the valley. It splashed into the shallows, water exploding around its chest as it surged forward, each stride pulling it closer to the blind. Jake's heartbeat quickened, adrenaline rising with the realization that his first shot had not been enough. He chambered another round and fired again, the muzzle flashing in the dim dawn, the bullet striking but failing to halt the charge. Panic edged into him as the bear closed the distance with terrifying speed. He fired again and again, the roar of his rifle blending with the guttural sounds of the beast, 25 rounds in total, tearing through the space between them. Some struck muscle, glancing off bone or sinking deep into thick fur. Others missed their mark in the frenzy of the moment. Yet the Kodiak kept coming, its rage pushing it forward, its body fueled by primal strength that refused to break even under extreme trauma. Water churned as claws slashed the surface, the animal's massive frame bearing down on the blind. Jake could see its teeth snapping, the white of foam at its jaws, the spray of blood from its wounds mixing with the lake. He felt the ground vibrate with each stride, the force of nature itself embodied in one relentless body. His rifle grew hot, his shoulder bruised from recoil, yet still he fired, desperate for one shot that would finally end it. The blind shook as the bear reached the edge, swiping with claws that ripped through the fabric and tore into the earth. Jake tried to move, his body straining as adrenaline battled fear, but the beast was upon him. One paw slammed across his chest, claws tearing deep, ribs cracking under the force, his breath stolen by the impact. Another blow raked his arm, opening gashes that burned with every movement. He staggered back, pinned between survival and collapse, the sound of his own ragged breathing mingling with the snarls of the animal. High above, another hunter had been watching from a ridge, his rifle steadied on a rock, his eyes tracking every second of the chaos below. He waited for the narrowest moment when Jake was still alive, but seconds from being crushed, and then he fired. The crack of the shot cut through the frenzy, precise and final. The bullet struck true, driving through the skull of the giant bear, ending its charge in a spray of blood and silence. The Kodiak fell in a heap at the water's edge, its massive body collapsing into the shallows, waves spreading outward as the weight of the animal settled into the lake. For a moment nothing moved, the air heavy with smoke and mist, until Jake stumbled backward, his body torn and battered but alive. His chest burned with every breath, his ribs fractured, his arm and side pouring blood, his gear shredded beyond recognition. Yet survival itself felt like a victory, earned in the most brutal test of his life. Guides and hunters rushed from their positions, pulling him from the wreckage of the blind, binding his wounds with strips of fabric, their voices filled with urgency. His vision blurred with pain, his body weak, but his mind held the memory of the charge, the image of the bear that had defied death until the very last second. The animal lay sprawled in the water, its immense frame a reminder of the scale of danger these hunts carried, no matter how prepared the men who faced it believed themselves to be. Later, when the guides spoke of the encounter, they explained what seasoned hunters already knew but seldom saw with their own eyes. Dominant Kodiak males, driven by size, power, and aggression, could continue their assault even under unimaginable trauma, their bodies fueled by instinct and rage beyond measure. No number of shots guaranteed safety once such a bear had committed to the charge, and no hunter could ever take their strength lightly. For Jake, the scars carved into his body and the ache of broken bones would never let him forget. The lake, the blind, the 25 rounds, and the final desperate shot from a comrade would remain burned into memory, a testament to how thin the line between triumph and tragedy truly was on Kodiak Island. On January 16, 2025, the small village near the Barents Sea awoke under a pale Arctic sky, the kind of gray light that made every snowdrift appear endless and every shadow sharper. The wind bit through layered clothing and rattled rooftops, and the streets, packed with ice and powder, were slick even beneath thick boots. Children ran along frozen paths with sleds in hand, their laughter echoing across the empty expanses, unaware of the danger that had already stalked the outskirts for hours. Veteran hunter Eric Lund, seasoned by decades of northern hunts, patrolled along the edge of town, moving silently on a snowmobile with his .375 H&H cradled in gloved hands. He had tracked reports all morning. A massive polar bear had been spotted too close to the settlement, an animal likely driven inland by the receding sea ice and the hunger that came with it. Eric had approached this hunt with the meticulous care that years of experience demanded. He wore layered Arctic camouflage, his scent masked with blockers tested in previous winters, and had chosen a route that offered both cover and mobility. The snowmobile allowed him to reach vulnerable areas quickly, but he knew it would do little if the bear charged unexpectedly. Any mistake, any hesitation could prove fatal. His focus was absolute, every breath measured, every shift in the snow a signal of the predator's approach. From the north, the bear emerged, its form almost spectral against the dull horizon, massive and white, yet defined by the subtle movement of muscle beneath thick fur. Its head swung low, eyes scanning the landscape, sniffing the air for elk, fish, or human presence. Eric's pulse tightened as he noticed the proximity of the children on the sleds, huddled together on a small rise, their bright coats flashing like beacons. Time seemed to stretch in fractions of a second, each one weighted with the knowledge that the bear could cover the distance faster than any human could react. He steadied the rifle, bracing it against his shoulder and the snowmobile frame. The first shot was aimed precisely at the shoulder, a calculated strike to slow the predator without endangering the children. The crack of the .375 H&H rolled across the frozen fields, and the bullet struck true, staggering the bear, sending it tumbling slightly but failing to stop the surge of raw strength and fury. It roared, a low, terrifying sound that resonated through the icy air, then surged forward again, claws tearing at the snowmobile's metal and sending shards of ice scattering like glass. The bear's intelligence was obvious in its movements, circling and testing, pausing only to shift weight and evaluate its target. Eric fired again, forcing it back momentarily. Yet the animal pressed closer, snapping teeth and swiping paws that splintered wooden fences and scattered sleds. One child screamed as a paw brushed past, grazing a leg, but Eric's next shot struck deeper, staggering the predator. The bear's advance slowed, but each step remained deliberate, powerful, and unyielding. Eric's body tensed, muscles straining against adrenaline and fear as he moved the snowmobile to maintain a buffer between himself and the bear. He adjusted for distance, wind, and the slick, uneven surface of snow and ice, aware that a single miscalculation could send him into harm's way. He fired again, carefully placing round after round, some glancing off bone, others embedding in thick muscle. But the bear continued forward, driven by instinct and the desperation of hunger that had brought it so close to human settlement. From a ridge above, another experienced hunter observed the unfolding scene. He had trained for situations exactly like this, waiting for the precise moment to act. The bear, enraged and stubborn, was close to breaking the boundary of the village, and Eric, though capable, was now exposed. The second hunter fired a clean, well-aimed shot to the chest, and the polar bear finally collapsed, massive body hitting the snow with a tremor that rippled through the frozen ground. Silence fell over the settlement, broken only by the labored breathing of the hunters and the distant wails of frightened children. Eric stumbled from the snowmobile, wounds already evident, deep claw marks across his arms, bruises forming along his ribs, and a shoulder that burned from the force of impact and repeated struggle. His adrenaline carried him for a few steps before fatigue and shock forced him to pause. The other hunter rushed down, helping to stabilize him as they surveyed the aftermath. Fences were splintered, snow churned into deep tracks, and the children had been pulled to safety, shaken but unharmed beyond the single graze. The bear's body lay still, a reminder of both the danger inherent in these northern hunts and the scale of power they demanded respect for. Later, guides emphasized the lessons embedded in the day's events. Polar bears, especially males of dominant size, could continue aggressive behavior even under extreme trauma. Their intelligence, strength, and relentless nature meant that hunters, even seasoned veterans like Eric, required absolute precision, calm, and careful positioning. The Arctic offered no second chances. Every encounter demanded respect for the environment, the animal, and the razor-thin margin between life and death. For Eric, the scars across his arms and ribs would remain as physical reminders, but the memory of January 16, 2025 lingered deeper. The roar of the bear, the crack of the first shot, and the terror of seeing children so close to danger would remain etched in his mind. In that frozen village along the Barents Sea, survival had depended on skill, focus, and the rare alignment of timing and experience. The Arctic had tested him, and though he had survived, the encounter had reaffirmed the unforgiving truth of hunting in the wildest reaches of the world. Even the most prepared could be humbled by the raw power of a predator at the peak of hunger and strength. October 6, 2022, dawned with the chill of early autumn in northern British Columbia, the forest air crisp with frost and the scent of pine and damp earth. Hunter Mark Foster had been moving along a remote logging road for hours, following the tracks of a mature bull moose reported near a ridge that cut through dense alder and fir. The vehicle rattled over gravel, the engine low and steady, while Mark scanned the terrain for signs of movement, his .30 .06 ready across his lap and his senses sharpened by experience. He had hunted these woods for decades, proud of his skill and knowledge, confident in his ability to read the land, the tracks, and the animals that moved through it. Mark wore full scent-blocking gear, layered and tight, designed to mask human odor from the alert noses of large ungulates. He had parked the ATV briefly at a gentle slope where the road narrowed, stepping off to glass the ridge ahead with binoculars, scanning for the slightest movement that might indicate an approaching bull. The morning light caught on frost-tipped branches, and every shadow seemed to twist and shift with the potential of hidden danger. Mark's eyes flicked constantly, trained to catch patterns and breaks in the undergrowth, unaware that a bull, agitated by the rut and driven by hormones and territorial instincts, had already noticed the vibrations of the engine and the scent of the hunter nearby. The first sign of the bull's presence was a low snort, almost masked by the wind, followed by a sudden glimpse of antlers cresting the ridge only 20 yards away. The moose, massive and thick with muscle, had moved faster than Mark anticipated, closing the distance almost silently until the crunch of gravel beneath its hooves announced its charge. The bull's eyes were dark with agitation, its nostrils flaring as it pawed the ground and prepared to strike. Mark's training kicked in, but instinct alone could not negate the surprise. Even seasoned hunters were vulnerable when a rutting bull decided to attack. The charge came with explosive force. The bull lunged toward the ATV as Mark attempted to scramble back, its massive frame colliding with the vehicle with a deafening crash that twisted metal and sent gravel spraying into the air. Mark was thrown violently onto the roadside, the impact driving his body into the jagged shoulder, fracturing his ankle instantly. Pain exploded up his leg, the bones straining against the force, while the shrapnel of gravel cut deep lines across his shin and thigh. His pants shredded under the collision, exposing raw skin to the cold morning air, blood seeping into the frost beneath him. The bull did not pause. Snorting and pawing the earth, it circled Mark with deliberate menace, jaws snapping perilously close to his fallen body. Every breath he drew burned with the effort to remain conscious, every movement a struggle as he tried to keep the rifle steady enough to aim a follow-up shot. Adrenaline surged through him, a wild, hot energy that countered the freezing air and numbed some of the pain, giving him the strength to react despite fractured bones and lacerated flesh. Mark rolled onto his side as the bull came in for another sweep, narrowly avoiding the snapping jaws and the thrusting hooves that would have crushed him. He raised the .30 .06, squeezing the trigger with hands that shook violently. The shot cracked through the morning, echoing along the logging road and scattering loose gravel in a cloud around the enraged animal. The bull jerked, startled but far from subdued, its massive body pivoting and stamping the earth with defiance, muscles coiling and releasing in a dangerous rhythm that marked every step it took toward him. The struggle stretched for tense moments that felt like hours. Mark fired again, aiming at the shoulder and chest, striking the animal solidly enough to halt the immediate charge, but not to drive it from the clearing. The bull hesitated, nostrils flaring, eyes locked on the hunter, then slowly circled back into the dense alder lining the road. Its massive antlers brushed branches and snapped small trees in the retreat, leaving a path of destruction behind it, before it finally vanished from sight, leaving only the echo of snorts and the tremor of the ground beneath Mark's body. Breathing hard and shaking from both adrenaline and pain, Mark dragged himself away from the road, testing his fractured ankle and wincing with each step. The gravel dug into his skin, his shredded pants catching on branches as he moved toward a patch of fur where he could assess the injuries and stop the bleeding as best as possible. The forest seemed impossibly quiet after the chaos, the wind whispering through alder and fir in stark contrast to the explosive power of the bull's charge. He pressed strips of cloth into deep lacerations, the blood warm against frozen fingers, while every nerve in his body screamed from shock and bruising. When guides later spoke of the encounter, they emphasized a lesson every hunter must respect. Rutting bulls, unlike other game, react with explosive aggression to human presence, and even vehicles, those metal tools meant to give speed and cover, offer only limited protection. A logging road, which appears open and safe, can become deceptively lethal when a massive animal reacts without warning. Experience and preparation matter, but instinct and raw power are forces that no hunter can ever fully control. For Mark, the memory of October 6, 2022 would be as sharp as the cuts on his leg. The roar of the bull, the thunder of hooves on gravel, and the violent collision with the ATV would remain vivid, burned into the mind alongside the lesson of respect and caution. Survival had required skill, speed, and split-second judgment, and though the bull had retreated, the experience left scars both visible and invisible. A reminder that in the wild forests of northern British Columbia, the margin between life and death could be measured in mere seconds, and no hunter, however seasoned, was ever entirely safe.